My name is Greg Hart. I'm the other Greg tonight. And I'm the president of the Architectural Foundation. So welcome to our educational public forum on housing policy with Assemblymember Gregg Hart. Thank you very much for being here tonight. We really appreciate it. This is going to be the first of several forums and lectures that AFSB is planning over the next few months. And so before we begin with our presentation, just a couple of housekeeping things. There are restrooms that are on the far side of the lobby down here at the basement level. And the doors have little keypads on them, but if you just push on the door, they will open for you tonight. And I want to thank the members of the lecture committee from the Architectural Foundation of Santa Barbara for all of the efforts that have gone into getting tonight going. And a big thank you to Ron Robertson for hosting us tonight in his beautiful auditorium. So raise your hand if you knew about this auditorium before tonight, right? Oh, a few people. Okay, all right. For a lot of people, it was a complete mystery. I got to see it a month or so ago, and it was like, wow, never knew it existed. So our format for this evening will be a 40-minute presentation by Assemblymember Hart, and then we'll do 45 minutes of questions to Mr. Hart. And what we'll do is, because I don't know how many questions that will be, I'll just ask you to limit it to one question per person when we start. And then if we have time, we can come back around and take more questions. I will have a microphone and I'll pass it to people when they have a question. I'll probably start on this side of the room first, take questions, and then go over to that side of the room. And then Ron, gracious for allowing us to be here, but he doesn't want to be here all night. So he's asked us that at the end, if we could all leave the auditorium, and if you want to hang out and talk some more out on State Street, that's good. Assemblymember Hart said that he would hang around for a little bit also out on State Street. So that would be great. So being an architect, I get lots of questions from friends about housing and builder's remedy and what's happening, and things seem like they're changing very quickly. And I certainly don't feel like I'm qualified to, provide all the answers. And so we thought it was a good idea to bring Assemblymember Hart here tonight, someone that is a knowledgeable professional about what is happening. And furthermore, Assemblymember Hart previously served as a planning commissioner and a city council member and a county supervisor. So years and years of dedicated service, and certainly, sure, go ahead. And certainly housing has been at the forefront during, I'm sure, all of your tenures. So Mr. Hart brings a unique understanding of our local needs to Sacramento, and Assemblymember Hart will offer a context about our regional housing needs, highlight promising housing efforts that are worthy of our support, and share his perspective on certain concerning builders' remedy development proposals that exploit state law that disregard our community standards. So please all welcome Assemblymember Gregg Hart.
Thank you, Greg. Nice introduction. Well, thank you, Greg, for that kind introduction. Can everybody hear me? I want to get the tone right and everything. No. You're having trouble, Diane? Louder? Okay. Can you boost me up a little bit? We got the mic on. How is that? Any better? Same? Sure. Nope. Okay. Did I turn off the mic? Okay.
It's on. Is the green light on? You might have shut off. Got him.
Okay.
We tried it too soon. It always happens. Of course.
Better now than in the middle.
No.
Well, I'll tell you my jokes while we're doing the tech stuff.
Great, start with this and I'll fix it.
Okay, there we go. That sounds good. I spent my day, boy, there we go. This is better now. How's everybody in the back? Everybody can hear me? Okay. I started my day today doing my sidewalk office hours thing, which I hope you all know about. It's something that I had the experience initially working for Assemblyman Jack O'Connell more than 40 years ago. Jack set up sidewalk office hours, put out a card table on the corner, and invited people to come and talk about everything. So on Monday afternoon or Monday morning, we started in Nipomo and went to Santa Maria, and then ended up in Orcutt, and then Tuesday, today's Wednesday, right? I was in the San Ynez Valley, started in Lompoc, and then Buellton and Solvang, and today we started in Carpinteria, Summerlin, Montecito. Tomorrow we're doing Santa Barbara and Goleta, and it is a great opportunity to hear what people are concerned about and care about, because there's no filter, and there's no appointments, and there's no agenda. So literally, people are talking about everything, and we heard a lot about housing. Ethan was with me at every one of these steps. This is Ethan Bertrand, my district director, does a fabulous job, and I really couldn't do this job without his help. So Ethan, thank you. And looking around the audience, there are so many people that I have worked with in my many years of career. It is really fun to be with you in this capacity. And thank you for all your service to our community. Our place that is so special that when I'm talking to my colleagues in Sacramento about where I represent, they are regularly saying, what, did you win the lottery or something? You know, how do you have this job where you represent Santa Barbara? And this place is no accident. It is the product of generations of people caring deeply and making smart choices and thinking about future generations. And that's our responsibility. I take that responsibility very seriously in my job in the legislature, but this is a difficult time, and there is a lot of change going on, and we have to embrace that change, and we have to guide it in a way that works for our community. But I'm reminded that if we were to look at the Santa Barbara news press from 100 years ago and look at the headlines and the stories that were being talked about, I'll bet housing, transportation, and water would be headlines at any point in time, any 10 years, that you looked at the Santa Barbara news press from 100 years ago to today. So we're still struggling with those issues. We will never solve them. We will manage them as best we can for our generation, and hopefully for the next generation. And that's an important mindset to recognize, that there are things that we can fix that in the short term, and there are things that we just manage as best we can. And I think, frankly, housing is one of those. So when I moved here, when I was 2 years old, my family moved from Orange County to Lompoc. My father was the library director at the city of Lompoc. And then we moved to Santa Barbara when I was 5. Working people, regular folks, teachers, all the backbone of our community could afford to buy a house with one income. And that has dramatically changed in that time period, those 60 years since then. And it is really, really difficult now for young people to afford to own a home. It's very difficult for everybody to even rent a home. It is astronomically different financially. Probably in the 1970s, you would have to spend 4 times your annual income, to buy a home. Today, it's closer to 10 times annual income. And the statistics I think we have well, there we go. That's exactly right. I remember the slide. So, and this is particularly difficult. Thank you. Very seamlessly done. Particularly difficult, obviously, in coastal communities in California, where supply and demand are, terribly off balance, because, frankly, there's probably infinite demand in a place like this. People from all over the world know about Santa Barbara. I was just traveling about a month ago in the Balkans, and when I talked about where I live, people would go, "Oh, California." And that was a good thing too, because they were going, "What's wrong with America? What's going on in your place?" And I'm thinking to myself, this is the definition of balkanization where I am. These people struggle over really tough issues, and they're asking us what's wrong with America. But that's a different subject. You can't hear me? Okay, a little more. You know what? Maybe I should just use the handheld. I could do that too.
Much better.
Yeah.
Sounds, this is good. Yeah.
Yeah, let's go back to that.
Maybe take the other one off.
This is for the recording over there. I am mic'd up every way you could imagine. Okay. So now we're good in the back? Okay, perfect. So rent prices have risen much faster than income. And in the South Coast, an individual or household now needs to earn about $94,000 a year to reasonably afford a studio apartment and $115,000 for a 1-bedroom. Obviously, that is really not sustainable. And that's rent consumes more than 1/3 of pre-tax earnings, money that can no longer go toward food or transportation or childcare or retirement savings, let alone saving for a down payment. And so think about what that means. I know you can conceptualize that, how challenging that is for the young people that we need to continue this legacy of preserving this fabulous place. It is a deep challenge. Somebody like Ethan, who is contributing every single day to this community, is really challenged to see a future of being able to stay in this community because of housing prices, not because of the need for a good job, but just because of the math of housing. So the state has recognized this belatedly for a really long time. There was no role for state government in housing policy. This was entirely left to local government discretion. The state didn't really have an interest. The market worked, and things worked out. But probably about 10 years ago, the state started to recognize that the status quo wasn't working to meet housing needs for California. We were falling further and further behind. And so there was a renewed interest in really making the state planning process for housing much more significant and meaningful. There had been for a long time a process called the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, whereby the state looks at the population of the state of California, looks at the available housing supply, tries to have a number attached to that each region of the state would try to accommodate with housing and provide the needed housing units in a particular region. But very honestly and frankly, it was toothless. The state would say, local governments, you have to provide the zoning for this amount of housing, but you're not responsible for building it. The private sector does that, and there's really no consequence if you don't do a serious job of that. That changed dramatically in the last cycle, in 2021, when the state said, we need to make this more meaningful. We need to really make sure that the housing elements that local governments submit to the Housing Community Development Department had meaning to them, that the zoning that was being described by the local governments could actually be built by developers. It couldn't just be that you would rezone a shopping center in your community, imagining that somehow the economics would have that owner tear down the housing or the shopping center and build housing. If you were going to include that kind of a situation, you literally had to have identified the owner, had a conversation with them have plans. And that was a significant change in the way that law had been adjudicated. In previous years, local governments would submit their housing element, HCD would rubber stamp it, and that would be enough. So that change represents a very large number of housing units. And I think we have that on the slide for Santa Barbara County for the next planning period. That number is big, and it's big in relation to previous efforts, but it's not, 20 times larger than it was. So it's incrementally growing as the state is recognizing that the need is only getting bigger over time. It's unlikely that this will all be built. There has never been a RHNA cycle when the amount that was assigned by the state has been built in our county. Very, very few places around the state of California have met their assigned numbers. But you do have to demonstrate that you have the zoning capacity to be able to build those 24,000 units. And that was challenging in a different way to all the local governments in Santa Barbara County because of the scrutiny that in the housing and community development added to this process. And one of the interesting nuances of that is that the builder's remedy law for the first time has really come into creating an impact on local governments. In the past, since there was no tension between what the state was asking us to do and what we submitted to them, there was never a window of opportunity when local governments were out of compliance with their housing element, because there was no reason to be out of compliance. And there was no scrutiny from the state for being out of compliance. But this cycle, it was kind of a perfect storm where there was much more scrutiny of what the communities were submitting across the board, and communities found themselves behind the curve, delayed in responding. There was a lot of back and forth between the state and the local governments that made that a very challenging process. And a lot of communities around California did not meet the deadline for submitting their housing elements and getting them approved on a timely basis. So it created this window of opportunity where the builder's remedy law that frankly is really old. I mean, it's more than 40 years old. It's been in place all this time, but it had never had any consequence before this cycle. So what happened was, very specifically in the city of Santa Barbara's process, they were doing their best. They were working ahead of time. They had a concerted honest effort to make that deadline, but because of the back and forth, they slipped and fell out of compliance for a period of time. And during that period of time, developers under the state builder's remedy law can submit applications that have a fast track to approval. And that's what happened in the city of Santa Barbara. I think there are 4 projects that were proposed by developers using the builder's remedy law. And those projects are obviously very, very controversial. They would not be approved in the normal process, and they're going to get a lot of scrutiny by the city with the discretion that is available. And I have had a lot of conversations with the city staff about those projects because I was concerned at the state level. I wanted to make sure I was really well aware of what the consequences of those. I'm one of the few legislators in Sacramento that recognizes the need for housing and is a supporter of trying to address that problem, but also understands that the importance of community character is also really, really important in this conversation. So I have supported some of the housing bills that provide less discretion to local governments in order to urge the construction of more housing, but I have also not supported others. And that's the message that I'm bringing to Sacramento, is that we need to be really careful and judicious and thoughtful about what we're doing. It can't be, just eliminate local discretion and live with the consequences because we're not going to get good projects that are going to meet our needs if we go that way. So ADUs are a great example of, I think, state housing policy that has been very successful. It used to be, when I was on the Planning Commission and the City Council in Santa Barbara, there might be 1 or 2 accessory dwelling unit applications that would come across the planning department's desk a year. Since the state law has changed, that has increased dramatically, and those units are, I think, relatively seamlessly blending into neighborhoods. There are issues with parking, there are issues with affordability, but that has been a much more successful program than many of the state laws in delivering units in real time that folks are able to rent and live in our communities about. Some of the other more aggressive legislation, that mandates a certain amount of density near transit corridors, I didn't support those bills because I didn't think they were appropriate, in our community. So where are we with these builders' remedy projects? The 2 that are getting the most controversy are the Los Olivos Street and the Grand Avenue projects. They're enormously big. These are architectural renderings that local architects have shared with me that I've been able to share with colleagues in Sacramento. Folks, I think, always know what that image of the mission is in Santa Barbara, this iconic picture. And, this is a representation of the massing of what's proposed on Los Olivos Street. This is Grand Avenue. Ironically, this is a lot that was owned by St. Francis Hospital and then Cottage Hospital. They sold it, and now we have this proposal. The St. Francis or the Cottage Hospital housing development that is, I think, frankly, a beautiful example about what we ought to be doing about affordable housing, was very controversial at the time, if you remember when that project was coming through. And yet, this is the background. This is that project in relation to this. So I think this slide probably illustrates really well how we can do this right and how we should be very careful about doing it wrong. So why I am reassured that the city of Santa Barbara believes that they have legal authority to require the developer of both of these projects to go through the environmental review process. There is some dispute about that, and I have no doubt that we're going to end up in court. The city's going to end up in court probably with the developer over that issue, but there is, from the city's perspective, directly to me through the city attorney in multiple meetings, they believe they have authority to require the developer to undergo the environmental review process, which I think is right. I think that project, both of these projects, demand the utmost scrutiny. There are serious issues about the appropriateness of the development, impacts on cultural resources, the ability to evacuate in the event of a fire, a host of issues. And in what I think is going to happen is that these projects are going to get really strict scrutiny by the city of Santa Barbara. We will see how that goes. Senator Lamone was able to insert language in a trailer bill at the end of the session last year, specifically talking about the Los Olivos Street project and making that clear, so if this does get adjudicated, The new state law makes it, specifically clear that that project deserves to be looked at through the environmental process. I personally don't think those projects are appropriate, and I also frankly don't think they're economically viable. The Los Olivos project has a 445 parking space structure as part of it. For context, the Granada garage that the city built is 528 spaces large. That when it was constructed, I think maybe about 20 years ago, it cost about $26 million to build that parking structure. Today, I would imagine it would cost, $40 or $50 million. So the economics of building a building on top of a parking structure that starts out costing you $50 million, I find very hard to imagine would pencil out. And we'll see as the project goes forward. Some of you would have a much better, precise understanding of that, and maybe when we get into the questions, we'll be able to get into that issue well. So I understand there's a lot of folks who are opposed to these projects. There's organizations that are forming. I think SAGE has been formed to oppose that project. And I think that that is appropriate. We need to hold our community to very high standards. And but that's not enough. We can't just be opposed to things. We have to also, with the same passion and intensity, figure out what it is we're for, because this problem isn't going away and it's a real problem. And the state legislature, I am one member of 80 members in the Assembly. Senator Lamone is one of 40 members in the Senate. We are rare voices in Sacramento. There is a strong consensus that this is the biggest issue facing the state of California, is providing housing for the next generation and maintaining the ability for people to stay in California. So there is likely to be more legislation coming down from Sacramento that will give us pause. And I think the best way for us to address that is to get ahead of it by saying, what is it we're trying to build? And we have a track record with the Housing Authority, building affordable housing projects. When we had the redevelopment agency, was one of the best examples in the state of California of appropriate, effective, capital A affordable housing projects. So we need to think like that, and we need to identify projects that we can support so that we can have a track record when we're talking, when Monique and I are talking to our colleagues in Sacramento and say, we're not opposing housing, we're opposing bad projects, we're supporting good ones. And that, I think, community-wide, we need to think long and hard and find those projects and be supportive of them. Let's see here. The Santa Barbara School District's moving forward with developing units of staff housing at the former Palmer site. The County of Santa Barbara is evaluating its properties, all of its publicly owned properties, trying to identify sites that could be lower cost for affordable housing developers. The Sur La Table space on State Street, the conversion of that, it's very small, 10 units, is another example of adaptive reuse that I think is really successful. Next to my office on Anapamu Street is the Sanctuary Centers project that is 4 stories tall and has been under construction. I would challenge you, excuse me, Brian, 5 stories tall. And I would challenge you, if you have not been there, to go look at it and see how that fits into that particular neighborhood really seamlessly. So there are examples of super dense, pretty darn tall buildings that work in our community. And those other pictures previously are examples, I think, that don't work. So the county is also working to bring together school districts and cities. There's a real change, I think, in view from local government officials that I work with all the time, who are recognizing that we need to collaborate together and solve this problem. That if we are passive and we are, opposed to everything, we are not going to meet the mandate that the state is bringing down, regardless of how I vote. It is a majority in the legislature, and I can tell you I can't count to probably 6, let alone 41, which would take, to stop some of these bills. So I think we're up to that challenge. I think every generation of Santa Barbara has faced really difficult choices, and we have made the right choices. And this is our generation's challenge. What are we going to do in the face of a really difficult problem? And I don't think we need to look to the state. I think we need to look inside our own selves and really find the best way to navigate through this challenge. And I know we can do it because we have done it before. We have saved open space when people said it wasn't possible. just was at an opening for a documentary movie about the San Marcos Preserve, which, to remind you, was exclusive ranchette development on 100 acres up in the San Marcos foothills. The developer said, if you don't want me to build these houses, find the $20 million that I'm going to make on this project, and I'll sell it to you. And you have 90 days to do it. And people said, that's not possible. We can't do that. Other people said, yes, we can. And in 90 days, $20 million was raised. That property was preserved. It's now part of the county park system and will be a treasured open space forever. So that spirit infects our community, and we need to invest in that and win this struggle. With that, I'll stop. I was never going to talk for 40 minutes, Greg. I'm sorry. I don't think I've ever talked for 40 minutes in my life, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Yes, sir.
What percentage of this new proposed housing is rental, and what percentage of it is targeted for home ownership?
I don't know the answer to that question. I believe both those projects are rental projects.
No, not these, but in general, what the state is trying to target. Is it 100% rental housing? Is it 10% home ownership?
It's income targeted. So, Ethan, do you have that slide?
I see it.
For the Santa Barbara County, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, we have the numbers that show you by income category what the state is expecting. They don't make a distinction between rental or ownership.
Right. So a developer could build properties for home ownership as well as or instead of housing, as long as it's targeted toward the demographic.
Correct.
Got it. Thank you.
Yes, Paul.
Yeah, I was at a sustainability conference last Wednesday, so that'd be the 15th of October, and I was giving a little presentation on legislation in California and what we've been up against. And I read that morning an article that said the legislation had been signed in on the 15th that would take away the exemption from CEQA for builders remedy projects in certain situations, like near a waterway or near a historical resource. Do you know anything about that?
Are you talking about Senator LeBon's budget trailer language? Yeah, okay. That is a specific measure that she proposed and was inserted into budget language that specifically takes away the exemption for the Los Olivos project. And that project by state law now will be eligible to have CEQA review. But it doesn't apply anywhere else for any of the projects. Yes.
I wonder if a trade could be done for the city giving these developers another location, like maybe the old Navy Reserve place on San Bernardino or the one over Las Positas on State Street, and say, okay, here, why don't you guys could use this land over here instead.
Well, I think there's all kinds of creative ideas, if the owner of the land was open to different solutions. But the way the process works is, they have an application in front of the city. The city has a process to review that application, and they are going to undergo that. I don't know specifically where they are in that process. I don't think they've had the hearing yet to make the decision about the environmental impact report. The council does have the discretion to make that choice. That, I think, will be the first step. And I don't think there will be serious conversations about alternatives until the city's design review and planning process has been exhausted. That is typically how that works. Let's find out what is potentially realizable as a development as opposed to what the applicant is interested in doing. And that's probably mirrored best by the San Marcos Preserve example. That project had been approved by the county, it was ready to go. The developer had the bulldozers on the property, and that was what was going to happen. The community rose up and said, we don't want that. We want an alternative, and he proposed, the sale, and that's how it worked out. But it was a willing seller and a willing buyer in that instance. Yes, Fred.
Just to be clear, former firm, making six architects, the properties the gentleman was talking about. The one at Las Positas and State is the Indian Healthcare Center that's going to be totally renovated. There's a new two-story building that will house additional medical offices, dental offices, et cetera. So that's not being planned for, and it's not large enough for housing. However, the National Guard Armory over by Santa Barbara High School will be converted into the existing buildings going to be looked at for additional programs for the high school. But as you've seen that site, about half of it is an empty parking lot where they used to park the Army trucks. That may be subject of housing for teachers or whatever. So that the district is looking at that now. So that's a possibility that might occur.
Thank you for that, Fred. Greg, you wanted me to repeat questions. Is it working the way we're doing?
No, I think that this is working. Yeah,
Okay, good.
walk around with the microphone.
I would never have been able to repeat that, so that I'm glad that it's working the way it is. Brian.
So, obviously I'm in the middle of this all day long, and I do worry that first, put that slide back up with the numbers. We're not even going to come close to those numbers. And no, the chart that had the city of Carp.
Oh, the Excel spreadsheet.
Yeah,
Yep.
exactly. So, and I know for a fact that, Carpinteria, they did exactly what you said they can't do anymore. They zoned properties that aren't ever going to be housing. It's just not realistic, and yet they kind of have gotten away with it so far. But at the end of the day, we're relying on private developers to build this. It's still really hard, regardless of all of this, to get stuff built. And what I hear from my clients is, they won't go forward with projects that have even 10% affordability. The state laws are helping, certainly, getting things there. But I worry that we're not going to come close. I guess my question is, can we build our way out of this? And what do we do if we can't?
Yeah, I think you raise really important questions. And I'll be honest, those questions are not being asked in a serious way in the legislature. And I think that's a big problem. Taking the regulations that exist at the local government level to streamline the development of housing is one part of the solution. But there are major forces in play, economic forces that ignore all of that. And I would argue that that is a relatively small portion of the problem. I think, the cost of construction, the cost of land, the cost of money dwarf the cost of complying with local regulations, particularly if you're going to hang on to local regulations that improve the community and are necessary. There was legislation last year that I did not support that would freeze the building code for, I think, 5 or 7 years. Well, and I think intuitively many folks supported it for that reason. But, Sacramento, in its brute force way, froze it so that improvements to the building code that might reduce the cost of construction are also prohibited. So, be careful what you ask for. And, I think that our community has a real challenge to figure out the real answer to these problems rather than just saying, okay, well, we can comply with the state law, but we're not really going to change the trajectory of what's happening. So the innovative, creative things that are happening, cottage hospitals projects, the school districts projects, Sur La Table, we got to figure out how to replicate those, in a market way. And I don't do this for a living. What I do is, try and represent the values of our community in Sacramento with a lot of people who are really deeply concerned about this issue, but don't have a granular understanding of how it actually works. So there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of passion, but there's not a lot of precision. And I think that's the challenge. Senator Wiener had this big bill that was going to radically upgrade or increase density near transit centers. The bill was hugely ambitious and applied all across the state of California, in ways that were, I think, really damaging. But through the legislative process, that bill was ground down to the point where it is almost inconsequential now because it applies in very, very few places in the state of California. Only really dense urban environments, think deep in the core of San Francisco, Los Angeles, maybe San Diego, but 90%, 95% of the state of California has absolutely no impact. Yet it was huge legislative battle, people on, pitched views on both sides. So we are spending a lot of time and energy and not accomplishing much. Yes?
I guess, hey, Greg, the follow-up on what Brian said,
the developers who are building our projects are basically saying they don't pencil.
Mhm.
And that's the problem. And so they're even entitled projects with permits, they're saying with the increased interest rates, they don't make financial sense. So we're wondering what can be done at the state level to kind of increase that. And some of the ideas are the bonus density allowances that you guys can provide. We're also, if we can get another level of density in the downtown, all of a sudden the project pencils financially. And then also mandating kind of minimal to zero requirements for the low income or affordability aspect, because they think the developers are just crushing it and will just squeeze an extra 5% of low income or affordable units out, and that just makes a project fall flat on its face for for something like that. And then the prevailing wage requirements are another issue that we're dealing with on some other projects for nonprofit organizations. We're looking at a couple of those, and there's a prevailing wage component. There's a 30% cost add. So I know there's some legislation we can work around it with modular units, so we can build the site and then we can use modular. So they're trying to be creative, but those are three things that you guys should be focused on, that if we can increase the density of the housing in those areas, minimize the affordability component. We need housing of all types, not just one type. So, and then the prevailing wage thing it just kills projects. So great progress so far, but you got to go after those three things, or we're just not going to see projects built.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting question you're asking, because there's a lot of parts of that. The point is to build housing that's affordable to people that are living here, not just to build housing for people who don't live here to come here and live here. And that's much harder. And so the idea that we're going to eliminate affordability requirements in order to make it pencil so that we can build market rate units for people to move here from Los Angeles, I don't know that that helps us. And, gutting prevailing wage laws is another way to make it cheaper to build that market rate unit. But the people who need to live in that market rate unit need to have a wage that can make them livable in Santa Barbara. So this is why this is really hard. It's not about, stripping local governments and eliminating all state regulation to accomplish what? We got to keep our eye on the ball. How are we going to build affordable housing for people that live here? And I don't have an answer to that. I think the market forces are much more significant than we're paying attention to. We're saying we can regulate our way out of this or deregulate our way out of this. I don't know if that's true. And tell me if I'm wrong. Let's see, Diane.
So sort of building on what you were just saying, I think the state is trying hard through legislation to make housing more approachable to build, but not affordable housing. The laws that are being created in Sacramento really focus on market rate housing. If we do 10% on every project, we're going to have to overbuild the community by, 100%. And I agree with Brian and some of the other architects. We're not going to do it with inclusionary alone. It just doesn't work. And so why is Sacramento not focused on getting the kind of housing that we need? The affordable housing.
There's a really simple answer.
Because the numbers are right there.
Yeah. The simple answer is it takes subsidy to do that. There's no other way. Why were we successful? We used to have it. And that's the really bitter part of all of this, is when we had the redevelopment agency, we had the affordable housing set aside funds that were regular, consistent, reliable. The housing authority could land bank, it could plan, it could have projects queued up, and that was the golden age of building affordable housing in our city. And unfortunately, there were massive abuses statewide of the redevelopment agency process. Other local governments were not doing the right thing. They were using eminent domain to take homes away and build shopping centers and auto malls. And the state legislature said, wait a minute, this is not what we intended. And, in its very violent, reaction to a legitimate specific problem, eliminated the whole thing. And so we lost those redevelopment agency funds. When I was first running for office at the state legislature, I thought, that's a project. Let's take that on. Let's restore that redevelopment agency funding. The problem is all the local agencies that used to say, well, we don't need that property tax money, you know, having to go to the redevelopment agency is the temperature of the water as it exists, it's not a problem. As soon as that money went back to those agencies, they said, never again, we will not let you take that money away from us. So we effectively have gridlock. And so where else could you go to generate the scale of money that we're talking about to truly meet the need at the local government level? What would we do to identify a funding source on this scale and put that money back so local governments can get back to where they are? I don't have an answer to that. It is an enormous number. There are a lot of colleagues who understand this, who feel the same way. There have been working groups that have been talking about that, but raising taxes is about as hard as it is to get. What would we get a super majority, even a majority for on a local level to provide meaningful housing funds to build the housing that we need? I don't know how that would work. I haven't seen any polls that say, 50% of people would allow their property taxes to be increased or sales taxes or anything to provide that funding. And it's not like there's extra money sitting around. We are getting crushed by the federal government right now. We're being attacked by this administration. California is literally under attack, and we are reeling from that. 2 days into President Trump's term, and I'm sorry to get partisan. If I'm offending anybody, I apologize in advance. But 2 days into his term, he came to Los Angeles after the LA fires. Normally, a president comes to a community after a major disaster to console victims, to heal, to offer the federal government assistance and say, we're here to help you, whatever it takes, we're going to rebuild. This president came and said, I don't know if we're going to give you any FEMA money until you change your voting system in California to eliminate mail-in ballots. Nonsensical. What is going on? Maybe he just had a bad day. Well, here we are, 8 months later. Federal government has not communicated with the state of California for the past 4 months about the status of that money. And real people are hurting and need that. We don't have, $4, $8 million, billion sitting around in an account waiting to go. Our economy is suffering because of the tariffs. We're an export economy. There's a lot of businesses that are not thriving the way they were. So this is a really bad fiscal time. My timing getting into the legislature has been terrible. I came in the year after the $100 billion surplus, and every year since then, we are getting worse and worse fiscal shape, and I'm worried for the future. So, help me figure this out. I know what the answer is, but I don't know how to get there. Okay, we got a lot of hands here. We've been on that side of the room. Let's go to you.
I'm concerned about the effect on the community of these single large projects. Just the Los Olivos one, I've evacuated 3 times for fires through that corridor, which is 1 lane in each direction. And the effect on the community of how many more people right in that particular location concerns me, not to mention the effect on things like water. What place, if any, is there for the effect on the community of these very large projects?
Well, I agree with you as an individual citizen, as a person, as a resident of Santa Barbara. I share your concern about those things. And, we have a very rigorous planning process in the city of Santa Barbara. Many of the professional architects and planners are frustrated, periodically by that process. But those 2 projects will undergo full environmental review and be decided, through that process. So your job as a citizen is to communicate that to the city council and express your reservations and concerns and ask them to investigate all these real issues as it goes through that planning process, which it will take some time. Yes.
What would you say to community members who show up at a hearing on, say, a builder's remedy project, but any housing project with the protections of the Housing Accountability Act, and the decision-making body literally has no discretion except for public health and safety to deny that. And they show up and they're in this traditional sense of, if I come and speak my mind and I comment, then I can have an effect on this process. What would you say to those community members who are either not aware that there is no discretion or are frustrated
I'm tempted to say that I would love people to show me pictures of projects that have been built where the state taking away discretion has resulted in a horrible building. I asked folks at Carpinteria that today. Had somebody from their planning commission come. I said, I don't know the answer to this question. I'm driving around, I'm looking around, I'm seeing new construction that fits into the city's fabric. I don't see an example yet. Those are examples, but those aren't built. Those are going to go through the process. They're going to get, they'll be determined how they are. But it would be really helpful to me in doing my job to give me examples of buildings that are inappropriate, that were, didn't have local discretion, and the result was a disaster. Because that's what I need to show my colleagues, to say, this isn't solving the problem, this is making things worse. So you are in a great position to help me. And my email is readily available. If you've got examples of projects that you think are egregious and shouldn't have been built, show me them. So there's a lot of angst, a lot of concern. There's a regular rhetoric from some of my local government colleagues that Sacramento is making us do this, and Sacramento is definitely changing the laws. But I need to see examples of what didn't work. Anybody got an example?
Alliance Bernstein,
Where's that?
let's see on the way to the mall.
But again, proposed, not done.
Okay.
So show me one, because this is a moving target in the legislature, and there's going to be more. They're just pushing the envelope, because I think maybe they're sort of asking that question too. Where is the pain point? What's happening that's egregious and horrible? There's a builder's remedy project proposed in Carpinteria, 18 stories tall. But the developer doesn't control the lot. It's kind of a joke, So a threat, a lot of angst, a lot of, what the heck's going on? Well, nothing in that instance. So, yes.
So in the last 5th cycle of REMA, that's the last 8-year cycle of housing production, we had housing targets, and the state of California surpassed its market rate for above moderate income target by 131%. And in the moderate, low, and very low income categories, it only met 56%, 27%, and 17%.
Mm-hmm.
And that pattern is continuing if we look at 6th cycle data.
Mm-hmm.
So that is the problem I think we are facing. We need subsidy. So one question I have about taxing, if we can't tax and we can't figure it out at the state level, what can the legislature do to help lower the threshold for passing a dedicated tax at the local level? So in order to pass a dedicated affordable housing tax, we have to pass a 2/3 threshold locally. I know there were efforts to try and reduce that to 50%. How viable are they? Is that also kind of a dead end in your mind? Getting our ability to tax ourselves to have a dedicated tax for affordable housing.
Yeah.
That gap is wide.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. That is a really important distinction. Everybody familiar with what we're talking about? California's constitution says that if you want to raise taxes generally on voters, you have to ask them for approval. And if you're not specifying how that money will be spent, it only takes a 50% vote to raise taxes. But if you tell taxpayers how you're going to spend the money, it takes a 2/3 vote. I think that's nuts, but that's the law, that's the Constitution. I don't even understand the logic of that. Wouldn't you want to know what your money's going toward? But that's where we are. And so the legislature, gosh, I'm drawing a blank. And this is what's super challenging about doing this, is that there are 3,000 bills. I know that the majority leader, Cecilia Aguilar Curry, carried that legislation. I know I voted for it. I don't remember what happened to it. Ethan's going to save me by getting on ChatGPT. What happened, Ethan? Here. Thank you.
Good evening. So I'm seeing that this was enacted, and the digest of it is allows city, county, or special district with 55% voter approval to incur bonded indebtedness for specific projects of affordable housing, permanent supported housing, public infrastructure.
But it's bonded, so it's not a
Exactly.
sales tax, it's not TOT, it's not a transfer tax for a mansion.
I think what we're talking about is ACA 10. Is that
One, yep.
ACA 1? And that's what that is? Okay, yeah. It's just tough to do this, but you're right. I think that is a place where the legislation could do more. Yes. Make it easier for local governments to actually build what we're trying to build. Yeah. I absolutely support that, and that makes a lot of sense to me. Yep. Okay, who wants? Wow, we're gonna have to figure out a structure here because you had your hand up for a while too. So let's go here, and then we're gonna get this group over here, and you guys all fight amongst yourselves and figure out who's gonna go next.
I want to preface by saying I'm a living example of that statistic you had on the first slide. My wife and I have a household income of around $130,000, and we're still stuck in a 500 square foot super old apartment, no AC, no backyard. So it's in my best interest to see any of these projects going forward because the externalities matter a lot less to me. I need an affordable place to raise a family, ideally. But that's not available in Santa Barbara. How do you, people that you've been working with, other state legislators and cities, think about these projects and their impact on the value of homes? Is the idea that existing home values will go down? Or is there this kind of tension where you guys are trying to preserve home values and somehow deliver affordable housing at the same time without conflict? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I absolutely understand and appreciate, and I think you very eloquently described the problem. We're trying to fix that problem. So the theory of this, is supply and demand. If we build more housing, the price is going to come down and make it affordable. And I think that's true in theory, and it's hard to make that happen in a place like Santa Barbara with the coastal demand for housing. And so, I don't think that economic strategy works particularly well here. I don't think there's any evidence. Now, I was a strong advocate when I was on the city council for the average unit density incentives to transition away from home ownership and single family home construction to apartment building construction. And I made the argument that if you build an additional unit, that even if it isn't affordable, that there are people who have the means to move into that market rate apartment unit, and then we'll vacate another unit that somebody else will move into, and there's a huge trickle effect down to somebody at a much lower price point moving into a better unit, not a less expensive unit, but a better unit. And I believe in that. I think that's true, but I don't know that the evidence of the development of that in the last 10, 15 years is proving that out very well. So I think we need to look at the information about that, look at the data. When I was on the council, I was asking us to be really rigorous about, asking developers to document who's moving into what unit and where did they move from? And is there any way we can track that back? And, I heard from staff that was not something they could realistically do. So, but it's unfortunate because I think that would help support the theory or not, and we would have more facts than we do today. Yes. Either one of you guys.
I'm going to approach a third rail topic.
Okay.
I'm just curious if there's any discussion about a trend. It seems to be picking up that unions are commenting on projects, sort of abusing CEQA, getting into the CEQA process, what I think is extort a labor agreement out of a project, raise the cost to build the project. Is there any discussion about any way to control that?
Yeah, there was a big bill that, who was the author of that bill? Well, it was a budget trailer bill, and Buffy Wicks was the lead author, and it removed CEQA from infill housing development. And so I've actually voted no on that bill because I think that was just far too overreaching and has massive implications for serious environmental protections. But that's the degree, and that bill was vigorously opposed by labor until there were some concessions that were made at the last remaining hour. So these things are, all of this is in debate in Sacramento, and who knows what will happen next year. And Greg, you patiently passed, so okay. Let you go. And then after Greg, you.
Okay, so as people were saying in the back about, market rate housing has been exceeded 100%, and then low income housing has been struggling.
Mhm.
And getting back to redevelopment agencies, you'll say, no, that will never happen again. But it did happen at one time. There were abuses, and so those things can be identified. And couldn't a law be written where some sort of redevelopment agency under a different name could exist in jurisdictions? Because the idea behind that, correct me if I'm wrong, was that the city or the county didn't have to send all of their tax dollars to Sacramento, that they could put them to use here.
Right.
So why couldn't that be reinvented and that law be rewritten for truly affordable housing, so that areas could choose to keep some of their tax dollars here and have the city or the county or maybe even a private developer, if interested, to take those tax dollars and to build what is truly needed instead of building 80% of what may not be needed in order to get 20% of what.
Yes, absolutely. That bill could be written. I could introduce that bill in January. The problem is the organized opposition from the tax receiving entities, the school districts, the counties, the cities, that would line up, that would say, you can't take money out of our pocket to give to this other purpose, are massive and significant and powerful. And I don't honestly believe that I could get that bill passed.
So during the redevelopment era, money was being taken from schools?
Yes, absolutely. I don't know that people understood that when it was first introduced. I think there was less sophisticated legislative environment. People thought, oh, that's okay, it's not going to be a big deal. It ended up being a pretty big deal, and they increasingly became opposed to that. And when the opportunity presented itself, and these egregious examples, became part of the conversation, they leapt at the chance to say, let's dissolve this. We'll take this income back to the school districts, the special districts, cities and counties, and reopening that and having that precedent set that they would do that again is just extremely difficult politically. That's just politics, not policy. Your question about policy, yes, we should absolutely do that. That is the answer, I think. But how do we make that happen? We would need cities and counties to be advocating strenuously for that idea, as they advocate in opposition to Sacramento taking away local discretion about housing development. And that's not happening right now. Sir.
Yeah, so my question, I believe that the population has declined while our budget has almost doubled recently. So I think we declined by like 8,000 people. But my main question is that I believe the enrollment at UCSB has been increasing by thousands. And when I went to UCSB from 2011 to 2015, I couldn't get into classes. So it almost felt like I was moving to Santa Barbara, living in a room with 3 other people, had no income, had no job, and I couldn't get into classes. So my question is, have we talked about like enrollment caps and how many students there should actually be in this area compared to how much housing there actually is? Because I wasn't paying any taxes. I was paying tuition for classes I couldn't get into, but I'm just curious if that's been something.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. That is a huge part of this equation, and I neglected to even talk about that. So thank you for opening that door. UCSB increased its enrollment. Why? Because California's population has dramatically increased, and we have only added one UC campus in California in the past 30 years at UC Merced. So, if you have a kid who's in high school, your dream for that kid is probably that they go to UC, and there are not enough seats at UCs for all those kids. And so there is a big push to try and increase enrollment on existing campuses, but that comes at a price. And in our situation, we are fortunate enough to have our university in the coastal zone, and the Coastal Commission has jurisdiction over those changes uniquely. There are many campuses in California that don't have that protection. So our campus is subject to a long-range coastal development plan that the university agreed to. I can't remember the dates. I want to say 15 years ago, approximately, that said, we're going to increase population of our campus, we're going to increase the staff, and we're going to offset that by building the housing necessary to have that be a neutral impact on the community. And it was a landmark achievement, And it was something we were all really proud of, and the chancellor was proud of it, and the community was proud of it, and UCSB dropped the ball, totally dropped the ball. They had a plan, they knew how they were going to build these dorms, and they abandoned that and went down a really, I'm going to pull back a little bit, went down a path that was totally unsuccessful. They wanted to get Charlie Munger to fund the biggest dorm in the world with no windows. And he was offering a lot of money, so I understand how that would be attractive. The idea was, we're going to build a dorm, we're going to have this massive private philanthropic subsidy. The price to students would be, perhaps 25-30% that it would be otherwise, because that money doesn't exist in any other world. But it was a bad idea, and they spent a really, really long time pursuing that. And not pursuing what was right on the table. Just build what you said you were going to build. Now they are, but we've got this lag. And that impact from that increased population has rippled to our housing market and made things much, much worse. So
It seems like SBCC as well has increased enrollment. And
not so much. SBCC, I think they did increase enrollment, and then it has gone down now tremendously. It is much, much lower. And part of that was a foreign student thing, where there were a lot of foreign students in the community. That has been mitigated to a large degree. UCSB is different than City College. So there are many community colleges around the state of California who are struggling with enrollment. That is not the case at any UC campus. Yeah.
It's the most beautiful place in the world.
Exactly. I think but so is Santa Barbara City College too. And more California students, in my judgment, should go 2 years to a community college and then finish off their career at a UC, and save themselves a lot of money and get just as good an education. Maybe the folks from UCSB would say, maybe not as good an education, but I went to both those institutions and I think it worked out okay.
Do you see a cap like that?
I don't think caps are a good idea, because I think there's a real problem. We have to have an educational path for Californians. UC is the best educational institution in the planet. It is one of the force multipliers that makes us the 4th largest economy in the world. We need to empower the university system to educate these students, but we also have to recognize there's impacts from that, and we have to mitigate that. And if the university had done what it said it was going to do, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. And they will not make that mistake in the future, I don't think. And they have the ability to build this housing. They're doing it now. Folks in the way back have been waiting a long time. Yep, well, you sir, and then right in front of you. Wait. He was waiting longer than you. Then you're next.
Santa Barbara Housing Authority has been doing something for affordable housing for many, many years.
Santa Barbara what?
Housing Authority?
Yep.
And I think it's an opinion that it's very successful. It's been more successful in the past. What are they doing that we can learn from? Because nobody here has any ideas what we're doing yet. Brian mentioned none of these developers are doing it. So if they're doing something, they know about something, how can that extend? Or maybe they need to build more and more and more and higher levels of affordable so that they can take care of all housing. Because it doesn't seem possible that anybody could build anything, cost of housing, then give it away for free. Someone who wants to buy or rent it.
Yeah, yes, I know a lot about the Housing Authority, and you are exactly right. It's probably the best in the state, maybe the country, and the folks there know exactly what they're doing, and they are frustrated by the increasing cost of land and construction and the inability of them to have a reliable funding source to do their work. There's nothing in the way of them building great units and providing Class A affordable housing other than money, and that's our problem. That's what we talked about previously. They used to have a supply of reliable funds that came through the redevelopment agency. The state dissolved those statewide. Ever since then, they have struggled. They are able to get state housing grants, but it is not reliable, it is not consistent, and it's highly competitive, and it's not enough money. So and in the context of, should the state all by itself be responsible for providing the housing to local governments to do that, or should we together do that? Should we have a federal government that supported housing policy? Most places in civilized countries in the world have aggressive federal housing support for housing. our administration currently is taking away that money. So we're in a perfect storm of not having a supportive federal government partner, having the state facing fiscal challenges because of that environment and other issues, and this crippling state constitutional provision that doesn't even allow a majority of local voters to dedicate their own money to solving this problem. Sounds kind of nuts, honestly. Sir, you did stand up and you had a question.
To what extent does the city regulate short-term rental?
Mm-hmm.
And does it have any impact on the numbers really anyway?
City has ratcheted up its enforcement over short-term rentals. That was something, 15 years ago I was railing against and didn't have much success in getting the city to be aggressive about that enforcement. I think it makes a big difference. I think, every single one of those units that's a vacation rental is not a home for somebody who lives there. And I think that is a part of the equation. We're talking about things on the margin. That's not even on the margin. That's a big number. You haven't asked a question yet.
I have not. I totally agree with you about going to City College first, by the way.
Good. Go Vaqueros.
Yeah. I am also in a bit of a similar situation to this gentleman here. I just happen to be lucky that my parents bought a house a long time ago. But we've watched as our neighbors, actually mostly from LA, have come in and spent more on the remodel of their homes than my parents did on our home in the first place. And in terms of, you asked a question about negative structures resulting from state law. I actually have a positive story, which a lot of people know that I went into planning, who I grew up with. So they'll, like my high school English teacher texted me out of the blue asking me about the Riviera project. And I tell people about in Santa Monica, which had one of the earliest builder's remedy situations. There was a guy who proposed thousands of units on a lot that only was zoned for a couple hundred on multiple units across the city. And none of his projects were built except one. The city settled with him and they said, you know what? Whichever one we want you to build the most, which is in the most downtown area, we'll make that one way easier for you if you just forget about these other ones. And they settled with them, basically. So it's actually a very positive story. But I was going to ask you, similar to what he asked about, supply and demand. Dare I call it YIMBY, which is I think who you're talking about in the assembly when you talk about the 40 people. But I do wonder, these pictures here, they are capital A affordable, but looking at that table, actually the moderate income units and the above moderate income overall are actually more than the very low and low. And so, I understand, your reservations against some of these taller buildings on the Riviera, but where do you see, in areas that you represent, particularly in Santa Barbara, where would you say it is appropriate for, 6-story market rate? Because the ADUs are great. ADUs can only solve so much. They're not great for families, or at least not large families. And so, yeah, do you see that as being appropriate anywhere, and if so, where?
That's a fair question, and I should have an answer to that. And I guess what I would say is that I remember a presentation that Dennis Allen, one of the local builders in the community, did talking about sustainable development. And he had a chart or a graphic that was so powerful to me. He took typical California city density and compared it to, the best European capitals in the world. And the footprint of those European capitals would fit in a fraction of the cities that we are used to. And those are not 10, 20-story buildings. Those are 4- and 5-story buildings, but there are lots of them and they're very dense. And I think there's a great opportunity to do that in Santa Barbara. I don't think, we need to build 6-story buildings. I think we can do a lot in the downtown core with 4-story buildings. And I'm not in the position to be on the city council or make any planning decisions, but my bias is when I travel around these incredible European cities, it feels very livable to me. And I think that is why they have a higher quality of life, because they got a walkable, livable environment, and we should emulate that.
So what state laws would you support?
I don't even think you need a single state law. I think the city of Santa Barbara has the discretion to do that tomorrow.
Then why haven't they?
Good question. I'm not them. Have them come to the next one of these talks and ask them directly. Okay, yes, sir.
With the county being such a big employer, has anybody ever talked about moving the county seat to an area where it's less expensive?
Yes.
So what's the viability of that?
That has been talked about, and when I was on the Board of Supervisors, there was it was discussed in great detail, taking the county administration building and selling it and using that money to build housing and, moving up to the better area government center. It's not a lot of money at the end of the day. You can get rid of that building, but you got to build more in Santa Maria.
But you're moving people out of town.
People are moving, but people would be moving both directions. We have city employees and county employees who commute from Lompoc to Santa Maria. If we move the city seat to Santa Maria, we'd have people who live in Santa Barbara commuting there. So I don't know that it's a net win-win. But it's something people have looked at. Okay, Paul.
I think it's simple.
Ron, are we running the clock on your?
It's a simple math problem. As an architect, I look at numbers, and my house is in San Roque. It was about 900 square feet, sold for $5,000 in the 50s.
Wow.
Average
I've never heard a $5,000 number.
900 square feet, and the average household size was like 4.2 people per household. So everyone was living in about 200 square feet, rounded out per person. Nowadays, the average production home size, I think in 2020, was 2,400 square feet. And the average household size is like 1.8 people, right? So maybe there's a couple living in a 3 or 4 bedroom house, and they have a lot of space. So they're like at 1,200, 1,400 square feet per person. So we went from 200 square feet per person to 1,400 square feet per person. So that's an inflation just of space that you have to build of 7 times. And your thing
With a
said,
covered garage that probably didn't exist in the 50s either. Yeah.
Two-car garage, right? It didn't exist in San Roque back then. So that's why people were having all the loans foreclosed on, I think, maybe 10 years ago. Because everybody's getting a loan on a house that they're being believed that they need, and it's more than they can afford for numerous reasons. Now we have tariffs just getting thrown around on concrete, steel, and wood, and so all of the pricing is whacked for a little while, but it'll come back to some sense at some point. But I think the basic product that the production home builder is buying, in my talks with Jerry Bunin and other guys who do production housing, we can't build anything less than 2,400 square feet, so it won't sell. But because they have the ideal client and the ideal amount of money that they make per home, per unit, is maximized at that. But that might not be what we need. We need people to be able to buy a house like you dudes over there. I feel for you guys. Luckily, I bought my house when it was cheap. Now it's worth $1.5 million. That same house that sold for $5,000 in the 50s. Ridiculous. But where's the 500 square feet houses that people can buy and they can make payments on, and they can deduct from their taxes the interest for that loan and get on the financial upward moving elevator slowly?
Well, this is a great audience for that conversation. You've got a lot of professional people here who are dealing with developers, and let's ask that question. I suspect there's a profit equation that doesn't work, or fear to be the first one to put a product like that on the marketplace. Maybe we need somebody like the Arties who seem to be willing to take risks to try something like that and see what would happen. But I think you're right. People would be happy to have a house at whatever size. I suspect the 3 young people here in the audience would be, grateful for a 500 square foot, ownership opportunity for a home in Santa Barbara. Yana, Tom, then the gentleman that asked the question about you. What's your name?
Alexander.
Alexander, thank you. Yana?
We'll call it that.
Okay, good, thank you. It's a good thing the Dodgers aren't playing tonight. So.
Following the last speaker and then also your earlier comments on ADUs and how that number is going up, do you have insights, comments, reflections on SB9 as a method to create more intensity, density with smaller houses?
Remind me what SB9 was. Allowing for duplexes to be built in neighborhoods that were historically zoned as single family. Yeah.
That you can take an ADU, get an ADU approved.
there
are
have been.
obstacles
Mhm.
to building.
Yep.
SB9, what SB9 does is authorize lot splits so that that same unit that you couldn't afford to get a loan for to build, whether you got a building permit or not, can be built on its own lot and can be financed separately from an existing dwelling. So, I mean, okay, so maybe you don't have an opinion yet about how.
Well, I guess what I would say about that, and I'm not going to be precise, it's going to be a general kind of thing, is that you're just not seeing a lot of that happening. You know, there has been a lot of state legislation that allows for increased density in single-family residential neighborhoods. And I guess I would ask, you know, the professionals in this room, why aren't people taking advantage of that? Fred, did you want to have an answer to that question?
Yeah, I think that part of the challenge is SB9 works in a lot of cities where the blocks are flat. Places like Santa Maria, right? Flat ground. Santa Barbara, it's very difficult to actually know somebody that has a potential SB9, but it's on a steep lot. And it gets very difficult.
Cost of construction become really difficult. Yeah.
The cost of utilities, right-of-way improvements, et cetera. So that's, I think, the thing that's holding it back, and also the fact that, you know, the ADUs even now, you know, starting price is $250,000 on up. That's not always easily obtained by a single property owner. So I think those are the biggest challenge things to try to answer her question.
Sorry, John, it's not super precise, but that's a question I have too. What's been the real life application of these state laws in practice in other places? And I'm just not hearing them. Besides ADUs, I'm not hearing any home runs from any of the things that we're doing. Tom.
You mentioned Yardi. And back in the day, there was a community value system, an ethical system, a plan that was unspoken but was extremely real that said, this is our city. We're going to build it like we want it, and we're going to give it all the money we can because we have a lot of money to do that. And that's a pipe dream. But somebody has to start smoking the pipe and passing it around because that's how we got what we are. It wasn't because everybody started throwing in nickels and dimes. You know, there was some big money involved, and that had a lot to do with psychology. And it seems like we need the governmental mothers and fathers to look around at their friends and look at themselves and say, maybe I can be part of the solution and not part of the problem, because the problem is obvious, but you know, how do you jiggle to get the solution? It's not obviously, but I think it's a spiritual, it's a problem that is very, very deep, and that if we were able to attack it, the city would be the place that it wants to be.
Well said. I don't think I can add anything to that. I think, you know, we have really benefited in this community from famously wealthy people in the past contributing in big ways to our community, and we could use that help now. And the Yardis should be applauded for stepping into this space. One of the first people, you know, to do that. And they're not making money on what they're doing. They're doing it for the right reason. So we need a lot more people to do that. It's probably not going to be the only answer, but that is part of the answer, I think. Okay, you get the last question.
Great, yeah. So you started the talk by talking about the teeth of what happens if we don't zone these properties, if we don't zone these homes. And obviously
The builder's remedy, yeah.
Yeah, so there's some SB 35 talks about that builder's remedy, which sounds like we just lose discretion over the culture of the property, the properties that are built. And there's obviously some obstacles here that we have to overcome. Is how are we going to power these? We're already running into blackouts and brownouts in the area. How are we going to get water? How are we going to deal with flooding? We're going to deal with fire insurance that we're already dealing with in order to jump over this. The schools, crowding. So I guess my question is, like, what's the worst case scenario if we don't zone all of these let alone build all of them.
Well, we already have zoned all of them. So all of the local governments have put on paper zoning that to the specificity, to have achieved the level of specificity that the Housing Community Development Department at the state level thinks is reasonable and fair. And Brian made a good point about Carpinteria. I don't know the details about that, but there's probably, gradations of clarity. Will the market build this? I'm not hearing from people in the business that that's going to happen because of the cost of land, the cost of construction, and the cost of money. And so here we are. The market rate stuff, probably over a long enough time frame, probably will be built at some point, particularly in a place like this where there is massive demand. But we're not going to achieve the affordable goals that we need to really house the people that we're talking about in this room. And that's the challenge. And I don't have an answer to that, but I'm working every day. And the laundry list of the things that you talked about, the challenges, is what I face every single day. Those are really tough issues, every single one of those. How are we going to provide renewable energy to the state without opening up offshore oil development? And how are we going to make homeowners insurance, which now is another massive cost driver of somebody that wants to live in a home in a place where the climate is changing and that threat is only increasing. All these things are interconnected. They're all really difficult. And I will throw one more partisan thing in before I'm done. There are people who are running for office who say simple things and it sounds great, and it has nothing to do with reality. And that's my final word. Thank you. Guys.
Mr. Hart?
Yeah.
Assemblymember Hart, thank you very much for
My
coming
pleasure,
tonight.
Greg. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
What a great audience. Thank you, guys.
Ron, you had
Yeah, I want to recognize Tom Piozza, who's been here basically all day.
Thank you, Tom.
I'll just say that we have a film production company here and post-production, you need editing. You ever need to be on CNN, NBC,